And thanks so much for your time. I want to start with those images from the beaches in Sydney. Seeing the big crowds, does that frustrate you seeing that, or is that to be expected given the country is doing so well on reducing the rate of new infections?
Good morning, Kieran. Look, it is frustrating. It's frustrating for the Premier of New South Wales, and we've been down this road before. Obviously, there's a level of frustration. People want to get out and enjoy some good weather before winter starts, and they want to get out of the house or out of their unit. You can understand all of that natural human reaction, but we need to be very careful here. We see what's happening in Singapore and other jurisdictions at the moment where the second wave has taken place, and we want to make sure that we can continue the success that we've got. We want business to recommence and for people to get back to a normal life as best you can in this environment. But do need to be very careful about these scenes. It can spread very quickly. The level of infection is quite remarkable, and that's been demonstrated both here and overseas. And we don't want to give up the gains that we've achieved almost uniquely compared to many other countries. So there's a balance here, and people need to take responsibility for their own actions.
So the challenge in the immediate term, the risk is complacency, Minister?
I think it is. I think people look at the numbers that we've been able to achieve in our country, and it's quite a contrast to what you've seen, obviously, in higher density locations or cities like New York or London. But if you look at comparable markets, even in Italy, which is now sort of out of the news over the course of the last couple of weeks, but dramatic scenes there where the virus spread very quickly. And if people believe that we're immune in our country, clearly we're not. We were tracking in the same direction that Italy and other countries were headed in, and we've been able to offset that through the social distancing measures, through the announcements that the National Cabinet has presided over as well. So we don't want to give that up, and the important thing that we've been able to do over the course of the last month or so is dramatically increase the amount of ventilators and ICU beds, PPE stores, and by doing that, we've put ourselves in the best position to deal with whatever might be off into the future. But I think the level of complacency is one thing that we need to be very mindful of.
The fact the government moved quickly on the closing travel from China, from the hotspots, and the fact that borders are closed now, obviously pivotal to our ability to flatten the curve. How long will the borders have to stay closed for, given, as you said, some of the calamities we've seen internationally?
Kieran, I think the fact that we move so quickly on our borders, we move quickly in relation to cruise ships, I think that has been integral in the success that we've been able to enjoy to date, and we need to make sure that continues. We've got a geographic advantage, obviously, being an island nation, and New Zealand's enjoyed the same success, and they've made some tough decisions in relation to the international travel, which is a key part of their domestic tourism market and a huge multiplier within their economy as it is within ours. So we've got to look at what the next steps will be, but it's some time off. Now, you could look at an arrangement with New Zealand, given that they're at a comparable stage as we are in the fight against this virus. You could look at other nations within our region if they've enjoyed the same success. But New Zealand would be the natural partner, I think, where you might start to see some steps towards making sure that people could travel safely and again, in a graded way over a period of time. But it's very hard to see how we could open up borders with countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom, at this point in time. So that will be some time off. But we do want to get people back into work. We do want to see the economy starting to pump again. And we want to make sure that we can try and get back into a normal way of life as quickly as possible. And I think that's what Australians want as well.
But given, as you said, that success across the ditch, there is the real prospect of, at least in the short term, the hope of a trans-Tasman bubble almost in tourism and trade.
I think that's logical in the short to medium term. I think when you look at what's happening in New Zealand, the success that we've been able to enjoy here, I think that is a logical step. So we can explore that. And we're also looking at what our border system will look like in 6 or 12 months' time. Obviously, the Australian Border Force is responsible for keeping people of bad character out of our country. We don't want criminals, terrorists travelling to our country, and that's been the very firm focus in recent years, since 9/11 really, and it'll continue to be the priority as well. But there will be an additional overlay of security, of biosecurity, I think, at our airports in years to come, and that would be a natural response. We don't know what will happen next flu season. We don't know whether there will be another pandemic in 12 months or 12 years' time. We need to make sure that we use the technology that we've got available and look at assessing that threat as the human threat crosses our borders. So we're planning all of that now, and the synergies that we have with New Zealand, I think, is a natural leverage point for us in the short to medium term as a first step.
Yeah, that's interesting. So while the medical system's looking at boosting capacity on ventilators and ICUs and this sovereignty that the Prime Minister talks about in an economic sense, your department's looking at bolstering this capacity when we get out of the COVID phase in the event that we face another pandemic of this sort.
Yes, and let's not pretend that it's an easy process to go through, trying to assess whether somebody is well or not as they board a plane in Dubai or out of Rome, whatever it might be, particularly if people are hubbing through different ports. It's a difficult thing. So we've had a look at different technologies over time, given the scale and the numbers of people that move through our airports, 40,000 people inbound a day at the peak 12 months ago, and a very different picture obviously today. But in this downtime, we can look at some of the emerging technologies, look at the way in which we can assess whether people are healthy or not. There are massive limitations, clearly, but I think as we've seen, our response, as you point out, to close the borders initially to China was crucial in the success that we've had now, and we need to see how we manage those borders. Our Border Force officers are not doctors or nurses, but we do need to look at that biosecurity threat. There are all sorts of threats, not just to human life, but to animal life, and that's an incredibly important part of our success as a nation as well, our rural community, the multiplier that is, the export markets that they rely on. We've been able to keep out different viruses that would devastate the beef industry or the pork industry, for example, and we need to make sure that we double down on our efforts in that regard in coming years. I think this has been a real wake-up call for all Australians, and many other parts of the world, including in Southeast Asia, might deal with this on a regular basis. But I think we need to reassess that risk, and that's exactly the work that we're doing at the moment.
You and the ministers have called for greater transparency from China in terms of how this started and how it spread. The Prime Minister talking about an international investigation, that sort of thing. But do you concede it's very unlikely that the Communist Party authorities will engage in any such transparent approach?
Well, Kieran, I've made the point before that we want more transparency within the Communist Party of China and the way that they have dealt with this virus issue. We want to know more about the origin of the virus, if not just to understand how we can defeat this threat into the future. When you've got these wildlife wet markets where the flu may have originated from, we need reassurance as a global market to understand that this is not going to happen again in 12 months' time or 2 years' time. We need to make sure that we understand how we can defeat this and work with the Chinese Communist Party, and make sure also, I think importantly, that we distinguish between the people of China and the government. I, like all Australians, want to see China grow. I want to see it lift people out of poverty, for it to be a responsible world power, for it to have the ability to continue to be the great trading nation that it is. But we need a level of reassurance that's not there at the moment. And I think asking for that transparency, asking for questions to be answered openly and honestly is not too much to ask for. There are people who have died in our own country, and there are people who have died all around the world as a result of this flu. And I think their families would demand answers. And I don't think that's too much to ask from the Chinese authorities. I also note that there's been some clearly unacceptable behaviour in our own society, racist behaviour toward people of Chinese extraction here. It's completely unacceptable. People have been coming to our country since the 19th century. They've contributed enormously. The Chinese people have an amazing work ethic. They want to educate their children. They abide by the law, and they're an integral part of Australian society. And anybody that would seek to try and abuse these people, as we've seen reported on the streets of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or anywhere else, is completely unacceptable. And those people will be prosecuted if they're found to be acting in a way that's outside of the law by abusing people of Chinese extraction. Completely unacceptable, and we make that very firm distinction. My issue is with the Communist Party of China, and we want to work very effectively with them. We want them to be a responsible global power, but there is a level of transparency that's required that is not there at the moment.
Yeah, that's hard to disagree with any of that, to be honest, in terms of getting them just to be more open and also differentiating between that and the 1.2 million Australians of Chinese heritage. But do you think that there's going to be an increased, I guess, pressure from the G20 and other international bodies to say, come on, you have to be up front here, and whether it be China or other countries with these wildlife wet markets, because the impact is catastrophic?
Yes, I do. I think there will be that pressure, and I think countries like Germany or France or Italy really now will join this push as well. And as I say, we're asking no more of China than what they would expect of us. If this flu had have originated out of some part of our country, there would be enormous pressure on Australia to explain the origin, how it happened, and how we could demonstrate that it wasn't to happen again. And not just in relation to the flu that there needs to be greater transparency. We need greater understanding of the Belt and Road Initiative. We need greater understanding of what's happening in the South China Sea. We need to understand the influence that's taking place even in our own part of the world. And we need to call that out. And people need to know that it's unacceptable. China doesn't need to be involved in cyber activity in the way that we know that Russia, Iran, other countries might be at the moment, and we need to play by the same rules that the rest of the G20 certainly is playing by. And Australia wants to be a very important friend to China. We want that to continue, and we have the greatest of respect for them. But we need to be honest as friends and to work very closely with them, particularly in relation to my area of responsibility around foreign interference, around making sure that that we have the best possible environment for our two countries to trade and to swap and exchange information in the intelligence and law enforcement space. That's incredibly important, and those relationships need to continue to develop and deepen, but we need that to be done on a level playing field.